The email we got about today's presentation said, we really encourage people to talk about the future direction of the field and the most important topics as they relate to substance use, health, and wellness in young people. Essentially, we'd love to hear about what you're most passionate about. Now, I'm most passionate about looking for Bigfoot, and I really thought this was a chance to finally do what I wanted to do and talk about the search for the elusive Sasquatch, because we don't have a Sasquatch body yet, but we will, and we're working on that. But then I learned that wasn't what they wanted. So the thing that is my passion is the concept of giving psychology away. One of the coolest quotes I think I've ever seen came from a presidential address that George Miller did for the American Psychological Association in September of 1969, where he said, I can imagine nothing we could do that would be more relevant to human welfare, and nothing that could pose a greater challenge to the next generation of psychologists than to discover how to best give psychology away. I love that idea, and as someone that gets a foot in the research world and the student affairs world, I feel very lucky to get to try that. The person who taught me the value of that was my advisor in grad school, Alan Marlatt. Alan passed away in 2011, and I can't think of many psychologists and researchers on college campuses who within 24 hours of them passing away receive literally an in memoriam from Time magazine. Time said, in a world so often focused on treating addiction with tough love, Marlatt showed through his work and his life that kindness simply works better. Alan always put such a value on working with student affairs on campus and vice versa. Some of the best research questions came from having grad students in the front lines, as well as him working directly with students. And we were able to take some of the newest research and get it out onto campuses very quickly. So that concept of bridging the gap between science and practice, I think that we have a growing body of evidence-based approaches, but there are barriers to implementing those and how we bring those to scale. There's also instances where the real world gets ahead of what the science says. So I wanted to try and look at how we can consider ways to bridge the gap between science and practice, with an emphasis on what that means for prevention and intervention. I'm a big fan of top 10 lists. I think they can be entertaining. It lets you know, like, good, this guy's wrapping up, because you can see when it's counting down. So I wanted to come up with the top 10 things to consider that could move us toward bridging the gap between science and practice. But because of budget cuts, it'll only be the top 9 things to consider. One of these is to consider the stories our data tell us. You know, not only look at what's there, look at what's missing. I'm going to show you a slide that you cannot make up. This was an event that, I mean, certainly not only is well attended, but certainly people are excited about. No one seemed upset that they were going to this conference. I was at a conference that was actively, people were very disappointed that it was happening. And no one could figure out why. I was asked to be the opening speaker at a conference that Duke University was hosting. This is now almost 8 years ago. I was so geeked out to be there because the lineup of speakers were my idols in this field. And when I got to the conference, the hotel, they're like, what are you here for? I was like, the alcohol thing. And they're like, that's a weird call, just so you know. And I'm like, what? Why? When we got to the Duke University Conference Center, we learned why people were so upset. Here's a tip. If you're making a sign, proof it to make sure there's not a single word missing that would fundamentally change what you're trying to communicate. Because blocked off in every parking lot surrounding the Duke University Conference Center was the following sign: lot reserved for college student drinking and drug use. May 10th and 19th, 2010. The sign maker left off the word conference or meeting or anything that would have made that look less inappropriate to people walking by. What I love about that is you got to figure at least one guy walking his dog was like, well, at least they're cutting those kids off at 5. That's, I think they call that harm reduction. If you look at data from the Monitoring the Future study, 79% of students report that they drink at least once in the past year. It's important to look at the flip side. 21% of students do not drink. So we put the emphasis on, you know, this is the percentage reporting that they're drinking. It's also important to put an emphasis on, again, what's missing from that stat. Students in recovery, students who are lifelong abstainers, students who do drink, but it's been more than 12 months, it's important for them to know they're not alone and to feel supported in that decision to not drink. If you go to past 30 days, these numbers grow, predictably. 37% do not drink in the past month. And it's 40.8% that report having been drunk in the last 30 days. So what do most students do in the last 30 days? It's the inverse. 59.2% either don't drink at all, or if they do so in a way that doesn't involve getting drunk. So it's looking at how we support abstainers on campus, students in recovery, as well as that emphasis on positive community norms and what most people are doing. That said, This is data from our colleague and friend Clayton Neighbors from a sample of 1,124 students that had turned 21. He multiplied the BACs by 100, so you could imagine that 12.6 is a 0.126 blood alcohol level. You can see there's a lot of variability tied to holidays and events, with New Year's being certainly very big. This is just the first half of the year. And so enough variability happens that we also want to be mindful of opportunities for event-specific prevention, and also knowing when we catch a student, not catch, like, you know what I mean, when we're talking to them, when we have them in front of us, if they're coming off of an event that was very high risk, either we might get a sense that that student's level of risk is greater than it really is, or if we're talking to someone right before that, we may miss some of this more episodic substance use. I think what's important to keep in mind is that if you look outside of the alcohol world, here's a study that came out just last year that showed that we're a mere 2 days away from April 20th, 420, which for big fans of marijuana use is essentially an informal national holiday. Bravo and colleagues found that more people used on April 20th than weekdays or weekends at any other time throughout the year. People reported more unique sessions of use. Some people try to do the 4:20 a.m., 4:20 p.m. use, or multiple times throughout the day. And people even used more grams on 4:20 than weekdays or weekends. So they said we can officially consider this a high-risk event. What's noteworthy is if you look at high-risk events tied to weekends, those tend to be the big concerns. And in 2018, we're in a 3-month stretch with 3 high-risk events that have already occurred in the case of St. Patrick's Day, or that are coming that fall on weekends. The opportunity to look at what that means for enforcement, for making sure that there's adequate staffing in our residence halls, for making sure that folks are aware of the opportunity to do event-specific prevention is very much there. I hope no one in this room, especially if you work on a college campus, questions that what you do to address substance use absolutely will pay dividends in the classroom. Research has shown that the more students drink, the more they report feeling tired all the time, the lower their GPA is. Heavy drinking is associated with lower GPA, and students at research universities who are, in quotes, binge or heavy episodic drinkers. For men, 5 drinks in a row, at least once in the past 2 weeks. For women, 4 drinks in a row, are less likely to be engaged in interactions with faculty. We know faculty interaction is an important predictor of flourishing and even retention. And finally, it's not just binge drinking, but doing it often is associated with lower grades in college. Our good friend and colleague Amelia Aria at the University of Maryland has shown that the more students use marijuana, the more it's associated with not dropping out, but stopping out, discontinuous enrollment from college, skipping more classes, and having a lower grade point average. The mere presence of marijuana use is associated with lower GPA, and students who over time decrease, that's a surprising finding until you look deeper, and continue to use frequently, are less likely to still be enrolled as you follow them down the road, and less likely to graduate on time. It potentially makes sense if people are using heavy and stay that way, but the folks that decrease, this study suggested that transition to college is so important, that first year is so important, and if people are using really, really heavily, there's the potential that, in essence, there's that hole that's been dug that gets hard to get out of at that point. But additional studies that all came out in the last couple of years, one showed that both alcohol and marijuana are associated with lower grade point average. But if you enter them in the same regression, explaining variance, marijuana is driving this ship. Alcohol effects become non-significant. Students using both marijuana and alcohol at moderate to high levels have lower GPAs over 2 years. This study showed that those that cut back or even stop do improve their GPA. We're having very important conversations in the United States about how to make college more affordable. And we should and could be having those conversations. Among the ways we make college more affordable is having people get out on time. Minus the major change here and there, not taking 7, 8 years to get out of school. What do we know? Greater exposure to marijuana, more involvement in marijuana is resulting in less current enrollment, more discontinuous enrollment, longer rates to graduation. What has happened in my state? We've actually increased access to marijuana. So it's being mindful of that impact. There can even be a direct effect on how marijuana use could impact cognitive functioning. Research has shown for a while now that the part of the brain that affects, among other things, attention, concentration, memory, motivation is the hippocampus. Truly long story short, after people use marijuana, the neurons in the hippocampus get suppressed. What does that mean? They fire, but they fire at a rate that's lower and slower than they could or should be firing. Now, we can make the leap that That must be affecting attention, concentration, and memory. That leap isn't good enough for science. So Harrison Pope, now over 20 years ago, said, I want to test this with college students. I don't want to get people crazy high, make them take a test and say, well, clearly it affected their cognitive abilities. He said, I want to have students use marijuana, and I want to test them a day later. 24 hours after marijuana use, there are measurable decreases in attention, concentration, and memory. And the more heavily a student typically used, the more pronounced those decreases were. Pope showed two things that scientists had never shown before. One, the more heavily a person uses, the more pronounced these effects are. And two, even for people who try it here and there, we can measure the impact of their use a day later. Critics came out and said, yeah, but that doesn't prove anything. It's not causal. What if people with attention deficits just love weed? Which is a fair question. So Pope said we can test that. Ethically, we can't take people who don't use and make them start, because that's unethical. But what if we take people that are using every day and pay them to quit, and pay them luxuriously for every day they stay clean? If we follow them over time, and their cognitive abilities stay the same, yeah, they were probably there to start with. But if we follow them over time, and as their marijuana use goes away, their cognitive abilities improve, that's causal. It takes 28 days, but 28 days after stopping daily marijuana use, there are no longer any measurable decreases in attention, concentration, and memory compared to a control group of people that have never touched marijuana in their life. Jump forward to college campuses in 2018. We have more students actively being treated for, asking if they have a diagnosis of, an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We can't diagnose if a person does or doesn't have ADHD if they're recreationally using the one substance most associated with causing, not just worsening, but causing attention deficits. Plus, if we're thinking about on a campus students saying, I'm motivated to really do well academically, if they're saying, my memory's not what it used to be, I'm struggling with attention and concentration, and they're using marijuana, calling time out in their marijuana use will pay dividends in those impacts. Susan Tapert, one of my classmates from the University of Washington, in her lab at San Diego, they looked at 15 to 19-year-olds that used marijuana 14 of the last 30 days. Every other day, verbal learning took 2 weeks to match that of people who abstained. Verbal working memory, 3 weeks. The attention deficits seem to take the full 4 weeks. Does this mean that most of this is recoverable? A lot of that depends on the duration of time someone's been using and the age in which they've been using. Maybe you've seen the headline, this got a lot of national attention, that people that use marijuana heavily and chronically, from teenagers to being in their 30s, lose 8 IQ points over time. Your IQ now should be your IQ in 5 years, which should be your IQ in 10 years. A study looked at Australia and New Zealand, looked at following a huge cohort of people from the age of 13 to the age of 38, and did IQ tests every 5 years. Those that never used marijuana at each of the time points had a non-significant, their IQ stayed the same. As soon as you introduce marijuana to the equation where it was used but never regularly, we start to see an impact on it lowering. But using regularly at least one time point, 2 time points, 3 to 5, it was the people that were using at 5 time points that actually saw a loss of 8 IQ points. We on college campuses put more of an emphasis on this than this. Not because we want to ignore this, but it's what's most relevant and salient to a person right now. And if it's the sense, I want to do well academically, maybe thinking about my IQ in 20 years is too far away. But it's looking at what's a salient and relevant, personally relevant reason to change. I showed you a sign at another school. I'll show you a sign where I used to work. I'm not trying to say this person had attention deficits, but something got lost somewhere in the shuffle. The hardest thing of working on any research project is coming up with a cool acronym for the name. I think we can all agree with that. And we had a project called the MC² project, Motivating Campus Change. We were like, that's an awesome title. That little superscript 2, that's really cool. No, it's not. That superscript 2 was horrible to try and, every time in an email do it. And one day, I used to work at the Evergreen State College, and one day I was walking into my office and I saw the directory in front of our building, and I'm like, no way. How long has that been up there? Not only had it been up there almost a year, for an additional 4 years, here's me in front of the sign, and the sign said, MC2, Bob, this should be squared, motivating campus change. Bob, the sign maker, didn't think very critically about the note he had received. And I was up the whole life of the project. when they redid the building, I said, I'll actually donate to the school if you can give me that sign. And they actually gave me the sign for free. And it's in my office in psychiatry now because I was told I had to get it out of our dining room. But it's, I love that. Number 7, THC is at levels our field has never seen before. So as a group of scientists, as a group of prevention providers, we have to respond to claims that it's harmless, non-addictive, or natural. I had to up my game on really getting the data for this. Last year, I was asked to present to 9th graders at Olympia High School in their health class. I'm like, that's cool. I didn't realize that that meant back to back to back to back to back to back with like a bunch of 9th graders. That's not my area of comfort. I like working with college students. 9th graders to me are very scary. To their credit, it was partly my fault. I walked in there, I'm like, hey everybody, we're gonna talk. I was like, oh my God, they're bigger than that, stand up. Plus 2 of them had more facial hair than I can grow. I'm like, how do you do that? But the teacher said they have tons of questions, and if you want, I can send you their questions ahead of time. I'm like, yeah, do that. She sent me 50 questions. I proudly knew the answer to 49 of the 50. One of them, I had no idea. And I cut and pasted it straight from the kid's email, complete with the 4 question marks. The kid said, is it true that smoking marijuana turns your lungs into orange slices? And I was like, I don't get it. Like, I didn't know if that was slang for something, like, what up, orange slice? And if it's not, it should be. Say that to people, just not out there. So I forwarded it to some of my colleagues, and I'm like, anybody know what this is? And they're like, the kid's messing with you. And I'm like, I don't want to believe that. I don't want to believe some 14-year-old is like, oh, I'm going to teach this professor, send. So I did what anyone would do. I went on Reddit, which is the hotbed of all things science-based, and I saw that as a joke, a guy posted and said, please forward this picture and save a life. Here is a picture of the lungs of a teenager who died from smoking marijuana. And it was just this picture of an orange. The first person who replied was like, dude, that's an orange. And the guy wrote back in all capital letters and said, stop being disrespectful. That's a dead teenager's lungs. We can look at that and laugh, but freshmen in high school were like, oh my God. You know, and they were terrified about that. All I know is I don't like to eat oranges anymore because they look like lungs, and that's terrifying. But one of the kids asked, this is verbatim from the email, what was weed or savage cabbage like when you were in high school? I was like, look at you with your slang. Now, we don't have good data on that when I was in high school. I was in high school from 83 to 87. Nora Volkoff has speculated in her publications that if you look at THC content, you hear about people who identified as hippies in the 70s who smoked grass. It's because it was practically grass. It was like 1.5% THC. In the 80s, the belief is it was about 2 to 3% THC. Understanding THC and why it's so important is understanding how cannabis works. We have an endogenous cannabinoid receptor in the brain called anandamide that has an impact on everything from pleasure to cognitive abilities, movement, coordination, and perception of senses and time. You'll note that THC looks molecularly almost identical to anandamide, and in fact, binds where anandamide would go. Everywhere you see a magenta dot is where THC binds in the brain. I've had people say, I've asked about their drug use, and they say, well, I don't use drugs. But then they tell me they use marijuana every day, and I'm like, slow down. I thought you said you don't use drugs. They're like, it's not a drug, it's an herb. And it's like, tomato, tomato. It's something that has very widespread impact cognitively. I can't graphically show you a high any better than the activity in the reward pathway of the brain. So this came out at the end of 2016. And it gave us the first definitive look at where we're seeing cannabis levels go over the past 2 decades. Every time there was a DEA seizure over the last 2 decades, products were sent to the University of Mississippi. And they were tracked for THC levels, CBD levels, any adulterants, and so on. In 1995, THC was an average of 4%. By 2001, we hit 6%. By 2005, we hit 8% THC. Then we started seeing never-before-seen levels that hit the double digits. This came out in August of last year, and it's Washington's impact report tracking the effects of legalization in Washington. They've made clear that in 2016, we had a never-before-seen 13.18% in our nation in terms of THC levels. When people say, well, I used marijuana when I was a kid and I turned out fine, it's a different animal. And we need to be mindful of what kids are hearing, what youth are hearing, even what our college students are hearing. What makes me anxious in my state? People said that's a never before seen level, never before seen until you go to Seattle. The average THC content in Seattle, Washington is 21.6%. Your reaction seems to fit. This is the average of what's available, not what's sold. What's sold, the average is even higher. Concentrates, hash oils, what people use for dabbing, nationwide is at 55.85%. In Seattle, it's pushing 72%. I'm not trying to get cute when I plot this, but the y-axis only went to 14. If you're putting Washington on the map, we're up there. And so when people continue to push back on it's natural, I'd way rather have someone use marijuana than have a drink. It's really, really looking certainly at a person's age, at what they're looking at, where they are developmentally, contraindications. But we've got to get past the idea that this is this benign substance that is, in quotes, safe. Number 6, in part, we also need to separate out placebo effects from actual effects of substances. I could talk about this for an hour, and I will not. But one of the first studies I was introduced to was work that was done by Dr. Alan Marlatt. Alan is credited with developing the balanced placebo design. Prior to Dr. Marlatt, the left side existed. We could say, we're going to give someone a substance and give it to them or give them a placebo. But Alan said, what if we tell people they're not drinking alcohol, they don't get any, but in fact, others, in fact, receive the substance. He said, we want to make sure these findings generalize to the outside world as best as possible. So, yet again, an acronym, he developed the Behavioral Alcohol Research Laboratory, or BAR Lab, at the University of Washington. The BAR Lab, everything about it looked like a legitimate bar. When I took this picture, what I left out were the tables and chairs out in the main area. But everything about this looks like a real bar, but it's very much a lab. The mirror is a two-way mirror, so you can get 5, 6 people comfortably watching what's going on. The Dos Equis sign above the mirror is actually a camera where the X's have been hollowed out. There's a hidden microphone. There's 6 microphones in the ceiling, so you can tune in to different conversations around the room at different times. Off to the upper left-hand corner was told, drink as you normally would for about the course of an hour. They're told they could get vodka and tonic or beer. That's exactly what they got. What we see, nothing magical. It looks like a bunch of people drinking. The volume of the group increases, people interact a lot more, all this social stuff happens. Bottom right-hand corner, we tell people we're going to give you no alcohol and in fact give them none. They're told they can drink tonic water with or without a lime wedge, depending if we had money or not. You laugh, but state school. Or they could get non-alcoholic beer. And that's exactly what they got. This group was also not that different than what you'd expect to see. Very quiet group. People just kind of looking around at each other like, so at best, it looked like people who didn't know each other who were asked to drink water together for an hour. Where you see the really cool stuff happen, you tell people they're getting alcohol, you give them alcohol-free drinks. They're told they're getting a vodka and tonic, it's tonic water with vodka on the rim and a lot of lime. They're told they're getting beer, it's a blend of different non-alcoholic beers. At the 20-minute mark, you cannot tell the difference between these two groups. The volume of the group is increased, people are interacting a lot more, people are shoving tables together and playing drinking games with water. By the 40-minute mark, all that social stuff you expect to see happens. Someone surfaces as the stand-up comedian of the group. Someone surfaces like the loud, annoying person of the group. What would you imagine is the top interpersonal behavior we see more than anything else? Flirting. And really schmoozy stuff, too. You see people walking up to people going, so what are you doing after the experiment? You're hitting on people? We're behind the mirror going, good line there, buddy. End of the hour, lights go on bright, stereo goes off, and we surprise you didn't get any alcohol. The social effects, the belief people were drinking, all that social stuff happened. When Alan did the flip side and told people they were just getting tonic water, but got everyone to the same blood alcohol level, they didn't act differently. But when the physical effects of alcohol kicked in, the attributions people made had nothing to do with the fact that they were drinking. They got tired, but they blamed it on a long day of school. They flushed, and they blamed it on the temperature of the room. They got clumsy, and they're like, sorry, clumsy, and blamed it on being clumsy. Alan's research convincingly showed that alcohol does a lot of stuff. But in the social or interpersonal realm, it's the expectancies that people have and the setting we're in. Jane Metrick was an undergraduate that worked in our lab. So she said, I'm going to build the world's first weed lab. And she did. She got a grant from NIDA. It took her 3 years to run her first participant because it was really tough to get through the IRB. It was really tough to get a DEA exception so that schools could remain compliant. She published a feasibility study to say, could we even do this in a complete, balanced placebo way? What Jane did was she recruited people and said, we're going to have you smoke a joint of something. It was all people that used marijuana, and they all signed a consent form saying, if you give me marijuana, I give approval of that. And she said, we're either going to have you smoke a joint of government-grown weed, or we're going to have you smoke this placebo we've created, which has none of the active cannabinoids, no THC, no CBD, nothing else like that. Then people actually got what they were told or got the opposite. They would have a research assistant bring in a joint on a silver platter, which I thought was very classy, and they'd say, we'd like you to smoke this completely. The person would smoke it completely. They'd say, we want you to rate how satisfying that was, how chill you feel, how hungry you are, how creative you feel. And then she said, we've got one last question, and then you're done. And here's your check. I asked you, upper left-hand corner, I told you you were getting marijuana, but there's a 50-50 chance I gave you the placebo. What do you think you got? 100% of them said, yeah, that was marijuana. Of those told her in the placebo and got the placebo, she said, there's a 50-50 chance I actually gave you marijuana. What do you think you got? 100% of them correctly said, yeah, that was the placebo. Here's my question. This group, they were told they were getting marijuana but got the placebo. When she said to them, I told you you were getting marijuana, but there's a 50-50 chance I didn't give it to you and I gave you the placebo, what percentage of these folks do you think figured it out and said, no, there was nothing in there? Stunningly, the answer is none of them. 100% of them said, yeah, that was marijuana. And of those told they were getting placebo but got government-grown weed, all but 2 of them said that was the placebo. When she published this, she said, I'm encouraging researchers to do this balanced placebo design. The problem is, from a practical standpoint, it remains very, very challenging to do. So this came out last year where they said, you know what? We've got to start looking at expectancy effects. Let's just do the lower left-hand corner. This is a study that I go straight to Mitch Earlywine's name because he's done so much in this field around this type of work. But this was a really clever study where they told people, we're going to have you use edibles, and then we're going to have you do a series of tasks and look at the impact on that. You're either going to be in the no THC, the low THC, or the high THC condition. And know that we need to have you abstain. There were a lot of rules. They said, we're going to have you abstain for 8 hours before you come in. Depending on which version you wind up in, you're going to have to be here up to 6 hours. What was the catch? There was never going to be a low THC or high THC condition. The only thing they were going to run was the no THC group. They gave people hemp pops, which is hemp seed oil. There's no active cannabinoids, glucose syrup, citric acid, sugar, natural flavors, and colors number 2 and 5, which are the most delicious colors. So they had 20 people. They recruited 32, but 12 of them did not show to the study. Can't make that up. But they had them sit in cubicles so that you couldn't lean over to the person next to you and say, what do you feel? But they opened an envelope in front of them and said, hey, you're in the high THC condition. They handed out the pops. They were complete placebos. After people finished them, they had them rate music and comedy clips, color designs, compute math problems, but they had to rate their mood. They had to rate how high they felt. What did they feel? What did they say? There was a significant reduction in people saying, I came in here not in a great mood. I feel better. Negative mood went down, and perceived sense of intoxication went up. When a student says, marijuana makes me more creative, does it? Or is that an expectancy effect no different than alcohol making people more social? We've got decades of research that show there are strong placebo and expectancy effects around alcohol, and that research needs to play catch-up in the marijuana world. Think about the seeds that are planted, no pun intended, when you actually tell somebody, well, sativa, that's uplifting and energetic, but indica, that's relaxing and calming. The second you tell someone that, that's an expectancy effect. That's a placebo effect. I love this quote. We would all prefer simple nostrums to explain complex systems, but this is a futile and even potentially dangerous in the context of a psychoactive drug such as cannabis. These authors note that the differences in observed effects across strains, across type, could be due to other content, which is rarely measured, or what you tell the person before they use it. If you have a loved one, a family member with a gravely disabling, potentially lethal condition who's had medical cannabis recommended and are using as recommended, then bless that person, and that's not, I'm not trying to question that at all. That said, my goodness, we have to play catch up on research. On when is it flat out contraindicated? Where is there any evidence that it would be useful? Is there a balance of benefits to side effects or harms to the person. And so more research done on side effects, placebo effects, and addiction and withdrawal. This article came out. It was in a journal looking at epilepsy. And I was so struck by their conclusion, and I thought, I can't say it better than them, so I wanted to quote directly from the article. The article said, at this time, there does seem to be a growing body of basic pharmacologic data suggesting there may be a role for CBD, especially in the treatment of refractory epilepsy. However, given the lack of well-controlled trials, we must also ask if we're getting ahead of ourselves. Clearly, this is an emotionally and politically charged issue. If this were any other uninvestigated pharmaceutical compound, would we feel as compelled to make the agent widely available before statistically valid Class 1 evidence was available for review? Until data from well-designed clinical trials are available and reliable and standardized CBD products that are produced using good manufacturing practices are available, caution must be exercised in any consideration. And they talk about the need for more research. So if you look at what the science says, there was an article that came out at the end of 2017 where they said we want to look at all the articles that have come out since 1975 that included a control group, that included any attempt to document side effects. Number of inclusion criteria, there were only 5 studies since 1975. The article made clear that part of the problem is it's a Schedule I drug federally. Schedule I means no recognized medical uses. So it's hard to do well-controlled research with large federally funded grants if there's not any recognized potential medical uses. They suggest that if any change occurred in scheduling, theoretically the floodgates would open around research. Lack of dosing guidelines. And ideally, research would need to find a dose that provides maximum release with minimal side effects. As it is, the optimal dose varies from person to person, dramatically. Plus, a lot of people are taking lots of other stuff. I'm taking this prescription, my naturopath made me this, and I'm using this. And I feel better. The credit tends to go toward medical marijuana use when the truth is there are many other confounds. Again, I hope no one mishears me. I'm not trying to dismiss someone who's working with a physician and seeing clear gains. From a purely science standpoint, though, there is a big gap between what's happening in the real world and what the science says. Generalizability is challenging. 3 of the 5 studies had less than 50 people. How can we generalize across age, across gender, across ethnicity and race? Trials need to consider differences in cannabinoid pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics among people, plus standardized evaluation and reporting of side effects. All 5 of their studies documented side effects, and they said people need to know. This is not a harm-free option for people. In fact, this came out in February. The headlines made me want to find the original article, so I did. CTV News in Canada warned doctors should think twice before prescribing medical marijuana. New guideline warns pain benefits, overstated. Canadian doctors warn pot is overhyped. I found the article, and there's an amazing figure in the article, and they said their goal is to have this in every healthcare provider's office in Canada, where they said it's a decision tree. If a person is coming in for neuropathic pain, palliative and end-of-life pain, chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and spasticity due to multiple sclerosis or spinal cord injury, let's move further down the line. But if it's not one of those things, don't recommend it. If it is one of those things, have they first tried 3 or more medications for neuropathic pain, 2 or more medications for palliative pain, or if refractory to standard therapies for the other issues? If no, don't recommend. You've got to try these other means first. And so, again, do with that as you wish, but I think it's important to really think critically about what the science says. We have a friend and colleague in the state of Washington, Derek Franklin, who often says we've clearly just bypassed the FDA on all of this. Christine Lee at the University of Washington asked incoming first-year students, tell us why you use marijuana. And they said lots of things that we probably hear from students. I like getting high, helps me bond with friends, gives me something to do when I'm bored, makes things more fun, music sounds better, it's cool, it helps me celebrate. But students also said things like, helps me relax, helps me sleep, helps me cope when I'm depressed, helps me relieve stress, helps when my appetite sucks, helps me reduce anxiety, helps when I have physical pain, helps when I have a headache. I get asked weekly, is marijuana addictive? Yes. And there's even a clear diagnostic criteria for cannabis withdrawal in the DSM-5. What are the diagnostic criteria? What do they include? Well, they include some of these very motives: anxiety, sleep problems, appetite problems, depressed mood, and headaches. especially on college campuses, if people are declining referrals to the counseling center, refusing to meet with a healthcare provider, because they say, no, I'm just going to use medical marijuana for this issue. We don't know if they actually have one of these underlying issues or if these symptoms are emerging when their use slows down. If a student says, I know it helps my depression, and you ask them, how do you know? And they say, well, I use weed every day, and I took a couple days off last week, and my depression was terrible. Then I started using again, and my depression got better. That's not medical marijuana helping depression. That's marijuana use stopping withdrawal symptoms. So we've got to consider the context. There's a lot of conversations happening about the opiate epidemic because of the addiction potential of opiates. Marijuana is addictive too. And what have we seen? THC levels are skyrocketing. Number 4, consistent enforcement of policy is essential. I'm anxious about Friday in my state. We haven't had, I don't think, the smoothest run necessarily. God bless the police for what they do for us, and I'm speaking more about in general what we've seen. In an attempt to keep this as non-editorial as possible, I'm going to show you headlines. Our election was November 6, 2012. The day before legalization kicked in, this is a direct quote from the Seattle Police blotter. They said, from the police themselves, officers shall not take any enforcement action other than to issue a verbal warning for a violation of I-502. Now some people are like, that's a peculiar call. And what they meant was, if someone's using in public, they're going to say, hey, got to remind you, that's illegal to do. That was out for a grand total of 5 minutes before it was spun. Getting baked outside, Seattle police to look the other way. King 5 News, one of our NBC affiliates, said 2 things are happening tomorrow. People over 21 are allowed to use and possess. However, remember, you're not allowed to use in public. At least for now, Seattle police plan to look the other way on the latter part until people get used to the new law. Other states made fun of it. New Jersey said Seattle police released hilarious statement about legalized marijuana. Seattle police to pot smokers, responsibly get baked and enjoy Lord of the Rings marathon. So people said, all right, well, how long is it going to take people to get used to the new law? I don't know what you guys would estimate. How about 9 months? Well, 9 months later, during the summer, there was the big hemp fest. And they said, well, something's going to have to happen. What happened was, Seattle police said, in lieu of handing out public consumption tickets, they were going to hand out bags of Doritos to HempFest attendees. The sticker on the bags of Doritos said, we thought you might be hungry. We also thought now might be a good time to have a refresher on the do's and don'ts of I-502. Don't drive while high. Don't give, sell, or shotgun weed to people under 21. Don't use pot in public. You could be cited, but we'd rather give you a warning. Do listen to Dark Side of the Moon at a reasonable volume. Do enjoy HempFest. I'm not gifted enough on PowerPoint to make anything cute and fancy with this. This was from consecutive photos on Seattle PI's report of HempFest. The upper right-hand picture is a police officer handing out the bags of Doritos. If you knew that park well enough, over that man's left shoulder is all of this. I stink at predicting age. There's no way that person in the upper left-hand corner is over 21. And people asked, is the mere presence of police around so much public use either sending a mixed message or running the risk of us losing control? After a very bad 4/20, 2015, business owners in Seattle went to the mayor at the time and said, you have lost control of this town. We're out of here unless you do something. So on 4/21, Seattle officials and business leaders say they are embarking on an ambitious effort to shut down open-air drug dealing and associated crime in Seattle's downtown core with this new 9.5 block strategy. The mayor said Seattle residents and visitors should not be forced to navigate a dangerous open-air drug market between the downtown retail core and Pike Place Market. What did they do? In that 9.5 blocks, plainclothes police officers were going to walk, and every time they were offered drugs, they would make a drug deal. It was recorded either on a hidden camera elsewhere, on their camera. They even posted the arrests. The story broke they were going to do this on April 21st. By April 23rd, 186 drug dealers, 177 purchases of heroin, meth, marijuana, crack cocaine, and other drugs. Legalization is going to make the illicit market go away, is what people were told. Didn't look that way. Is Seattle an open-air drug market? The data suggested something was certainly going on. I work at the University of Washington. I'm proud to be at UW. We saw, later that year, 20 suspected dealers arrested in U-District drug sting. Seattle police arrested 20 alleged drug dealers this week along University Way. 8 of the suspects have been arrested more than 25 times. Where do I work with Shannon Bailey, who you'll hear from next? Elm Hall. Where's University Way? Right there. Where's main campus? All that green. That's a lot of lawns to mow right there. that proximity of that much to our campus, that's tough. So then an article came out that said, did Seattle's downtown drug crackdown push crimes elsewhere? This was the graphic. For those of you in the back, the bar on the left are narcotics-related calls. The bar on the right is all calls. In that 9.5 block strategy, dropped 48% for narcotics calls, all calls 19%. In every other neighborhood, went up. Every other neighborhood, it moved it elsewhere. So I want you to know, in the spirit of bridging the gap between science and practice, that support for policy and enforcement is there. Levine and colleagues said a small group of students may be so vocal on campus to the point that administrators do nothing and withhold policy changes because they think the student body won't support that. Our good friend Bob Salt says there's a universal tendency to underestimate student support for policies. And he says directly, campuses would actually have more incipient support for a variety of alcohol prevention policies than is likely to be perceived by the students themselves, and by extension, administrators and others belonging to the campus community. Unless students are persuaded that such support is not limited to a fringe element, new policies are likely to be met with at least passive, if not active resistance. So again, do with this as you wish, but if the sense is we really need this policy to happen, you can make that happen. Collect data from your students to get a sense of how, what their level of support is. Number 3, the science behind media exposure and impact on use is so clear, and there's a lot of media exposure. I don't mean to pick on marijuana, but I'm going to show you examples that have surfaced in my state. Article came out now 9 years ago. Then a review of 13 studies showed that 12 of the 13 was that media exposure through TV, advertisements, movies around alcohol, people were more likely to start drinking if they had more media exposure, and increased consumption among those already drinking. Because if you're playing a game, it knows where you are. In Washington, a puzzle game on the iPad that I'm not very good at. You get 5 extra moves if you watch a video. The video I constantly get is for a game where you can sell weed with your friends. Don't know what to get your loved one for Valentine's Day? This is a half-page ad in our sports page. If you flew through SeaTac Airport when the US Open was hosted at University Place, you were handed a guide to the 18 holes. The 19th hole was go for the green. Every hotel that has Seattle Metropolitan Magazine or Seattle Magazine, including all of the hotels near campus, during Parents' Weekend, which we just had, there's the centerfold. Every month. Where I got super upset a mere few days ago was Friday the 13th, cool day if you're named Jason. There was an 8-page insert for getting ready for 420. And if it was just geared toward adults, maybe I could say, well, that sucks that there's an 8-page insert geared toward 420. But there was a find-a-word puzzle that's pretty simple. There was a coloring contest to win Mariners tickets. There was a way too simple maze. And there was a find the differences in the goofy pictures. And there's zero world in which kids that are looking for comics or puzzles in the paper wouldn't encounter those alongside all these things. News articles, particularly alongside pro-health messages. Seattle Metropolitan Magazine had an article that talked about giving marijuana to dogs. This was our state's Start Talking Now campaign. Teens are under the influence of you. It ran March 16th, 2017 was the big rollout. You scroll down a third of the page, and the human interest story was ways to personalize your French toast with cannabis, spices, and toppings. I don't know the ethics of accepting all that advertising money to run a campaign when there's something done that seems potentially directly opposed to that message. At the holidays, wine and cannabis pairings, crossfading, people combining alcohol and marijuana. There is published literature that makes clear that is it causes excessive central nervous system depression. Why do you not leave your drink unattended? Someone could slip something in your drink and cause a drug interaction. That is a recipe for a drug interaction. Cannabis kale chips that will make your weekend. No one's ever used the word kale and make your weekend in the same sentence ever. With 5 minutes to go, consider the context of substance use. I'm PI on a study we're about to submit for publication. We worked with 7 schools across the country, just shy of 3,000 people between 18 and 25 years of age, and we tried to ask cast a wider net as possible, have you used a prescription ADHD stimulant not prescribed to you in the past year? 17.2% said yes. We tried to look at, were there differences in rates as a function of other issues, or as a function of the presence or absence of this? Marijuana use, among those with no past or non-medical use of stimulants, 38.8% in the past year, 23% in the past 30 days. I can look you all in the eye and say I've never seen rates as high as what I'm about to show you. If they reported use of a stimulant, almost all of them used marijuana, and 2/3 used in the last 30 days. What does marijuana cause? Attention deficits. What does things like Adderall use to treat people with ADHD? Skipping class among those with no past year non-medical use, about 1/3, over half, and 40% of them said, I skipped class because I was high, I was hungover, I was still drunk from the night before. Heavy episodic or binge drinking, if you use a very liberal definition, looking at any presence of 4 or 5 in the last 30 days, 47% among those with no past year use, double in those with non-medical use. If someone tells us they used Adderall at finals, does it mean they have a stimulant problem? Probably not. Does it mean it's a potential red flag for some other stuff? I would argue yes. And we have other studies that show that overlap. And number one, parents are our essential partners in prevention. Mark Wood, also a good friend to the college drinking field, who passed away a couple years ago very unexpectedly, along with Annie Fairley, who's now faculty in our lab, collected data during the summer before starting college. They measured people 10 months later and then 22-month follow-up. They looked at social modeling, number of close friends who drink heavily and perceived friend approval of drinking and getting drunk, as well as parent permissiveness. You don't tend to see lines turn out this perfectly, but this is how the lines turned out. Top line, and this is heavy episodic drinking over time, high social modeling, high parent permissiveness. Even with high social modeling, if there's low parent permissiveness, that's the next line down. Low social modeling, high permissiveness is the third line down. Low social modeling, low permissiveness. Dr. Scher talked about roles of Greek life and other settings where you might see that social modeling. What parents do can absolutely alter a trajectory. I again shown you this ad about teens being under the influence of you. I'm principal investigator of our state's Young Adult Health Survey, where we've been tracking longitudinally and cross-sectionally now for 4 years. I'm sharing the 4-year data on Friday. At the 3-year mark, what did we find? Among 18 to 20-year-olds, when we asked, where do you get marijuana? There was a statistically significant increase in people saying, I got it from my parents with their permission. If parents are playing any role in funding a kid's tuition and ability to go to school, I certainly hope they're aware of the science that the more a student uses marijuana, the lower the grades there be, and the longer the time they will take to get out of school. Another significant increase is of people saying they got it from their family. If I could only show one slide, and you're like, why didn't you just show one slide? But if I can only show one slide, our Healthy Youth Survey asked sophomores in high school, do you use marijuana? And they asked, do you think your parents care? Do you think your community cares? Sophomores that thought, my parents think it's wrong for me to use, 13% of them used. Those that think their parents don't care, almost 60%. When parents take the time to say, I don't want you to use, and this is why, that matters. Kids who think their community doesn't care if they use or not are twice as likely to report use in the past 30 days. When we look at opportunities on college campuses, Linda mentioned CollegeAIM, and this will be in the handouts for those who work on colleges campuses who don't see this. There are almost 60 individually and environmentally focused strategies rated in columns of relative price and rows of relative effectiveness. And that's an opportunity to look at evidence-based strategies. But on top of everything else we've talked about today, do the best you can to evaluate programs and add to the list of what works. And in doubt, consider evidence-based decisions. If someone said to me, what's an evidence-based strategy? I would have initially said, it's a strategy that's got evidence. It's got some basis in the published literature. This article, though, by Satterfield and colleagues say there are actually multiple domains. There's the environment and organizational context. There's the best available research evidence. There's resources, including practitioner expertise. There's population characteristics, need, values, and preferences. And that's how we make the decision, the overlap of all those. Fixon and colleagues made this statement that I think is just so cool. I love this. The use of effective interventions without implementation strategies is like serum without a syringe. The cure is available, but the delivery system is not. We can work to find those delivery systems. When we have these evidence-based approaches, how do we get them in people's hands? The concept of giving science away, I love that idea. So to consider how to best do that. Consider to continue to build bridges between research and practice. Increase opportunities for collaboration between those conducting science and those implementing services. With data that are collected, again, promote positive community norms. I'm very lucky to get to work with Jeff Linkenbach at the Montana Institute, who's done tremendous work globally around positive community norms. Take steps to ensure policymakers, community members, and educators understand the potential impact of prevention. What you do about AOD will pay dividends elsewhere. Identify strategies for those who might slip through the cracks, and find that effective delivery system. My brother, I have two little brothers who are amazing, and my youngest brother was talking about an anthropology class he took as an undergrad. And he said there was something that happened in that class that totally stands out to me. Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, was asked, what's the first sign you look for to tell you of an ancient civilization? How do you know they were civilized? Was it some instrument, a tool, an article of clothing? And she said, a healed femur, your thigh bone. If a person in ancient times broke their thigh bone, they were done. Unless someone was able to help them, you couldn't hunt, you couldn't gather. People needed to take care of them. People needed to make sure they were fed. People needed to make sure they could recover. I hope I'm not being dramatic when I say we have a lot of broken femurs in our society, and I hope no one ever questions the work you do in prevention. I hope no one ever questions the value of the work you do in prevention. Because the people that heal those are not only in this room, it's our peer educators on college campuses, it's our folks that support recovery communities, it is our parents, and it certainly is our prevention community that I'm so proud to be a member of. So with that, I will again thank the folks that I mentioned at the beginning, and I want to add to that thank you. I get to do what I do today because Shannon Bailey and Mary Larimer were willing to take a chance on someone working in two different realms like that. And I feel very lucky to get to do that. The research that I've been a part of that I described has been funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NCAA, and our Division of Behavioral Health and Recovery. Thank you again for the honor of presenting to you today.